Hello everyone, and welcome back, wishing you a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a moment that will send chills down your spine. Tu Tieu visits her mother's home and discovers a locked drawer with a company seal that should never be there. What is her mother hiding? And why does she whisper, "Don't open it here"? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next episode. The mist was still thick over the tea fields when Tu Tieu finished packing the basket. She had been awake since before the birds, not because she had slept badly, exactly, but because her mind had been walking the same quiet circle since the middle of the night, circling the same thought, returning to the same soft dread. She was going to see her mother today, and she did not know what kind of welcome was waiting for her. She chose each item in the basket with care. A small pouch of the best dried tea from last season, the kind her mother had always liked, the kind that smelled faintly of wood smoke and high altitude. 2 oranges, firm and bright. A box of herbal medicine, good for circulation, for tired joints, for women who stood too long in cold rooms and never complained about it. And the scarf, rust-colored, folded neatly on top. It was the kind of basket you brought when you didn't know how to say, "I miss you. I'm worried about you. I wish things were different between us." Her phone buzzed on the counter. She already knew who it was. "Good morning," Yuri said. His voice was low and warm, the way it always sounded before the world had fully woken up. Tu Tieu smiled despite herself. "Good morning. You're up early. I wanted to catch you before you left." A brief pause. "How are you feeling?" She looked at the basket. "Nervous," she admitted. "I keep adding things as if it will help." Not because he was unsure, but because he cared about getting it right. "Go slowly," he said. "You don't have to win. You just have to be honest." She wanted to say, what if honesty isn't enough? What if she looks right through me the way she always has? But she didn't say that. She said, "I'll try." "That's all," Yuri said gently. "Call me when you get there." "And Tu Tieu, whatever happens, I'm here." She held the phone for a moment after he hung up, as if warmth could travel through it. Then she picked up her keys and went to find her car. The drive from the tea house took just under an hour. Winding down from the higher hillside roads into the lower part of the valley, where the houses sat closer together and the mist had already begun to thin. Tu Tieu parked at the edge of her mother's lane and walked the rest of the way on foot, the way she always had since she was small. The house looked the same from the outside. Freshly swept steps, potted plants by the gate, recently watered. The curtains in the front window were open, but only partway enough to let in light. Tu Tieu recognized that arrangement. It was not carelessness, it was habit. She knocked twice, softly. The door opened sooner than she expected. Mrs. Land stood there in a pressed blouse and house slippers, her hair pinned neatly. She looked well kept, composed. But her eyes, just for a moment, before she could stop them, flicked past Tu Tieu's shoulder to the lane behind her. "Tu Tieu," she said. Her voice held a note of surprise that was carefully managed. "I didn't know you were coming today." "I should have called," Tu Tieu said. "I'm sorry. I brought some things for you." She lifted the basket slightly. Mrs. Land's expression softened, one brief, real flicker crossing her face. Then she stepped back from the door. Come in quickly." The house inside was exactly as Tu Tieu remembered it, and yet it did not feel like a home the way she used to think of it. Everything was arranged with a deliberate kind of order, cushions squared on the sofa, a decorative tray positioned precisely on the side table. Nothing left to chance. It reminded Tu Tieu of a room prepared for guests, rather than one that was lived in every day. From somewhere deeper in the house, a back room, perhaps the kitchen, came the sound of a drawer closing. Then, silence. Lan led her to the living room and gestured toward the sofa. "Sit. I'll make tea." The tea, when it came, was served in good cups on a small lacquered tray. It was the right temperature, the right color, the right amount. It tasted of nothing in particular. They sat across from each other with the tray between them, like a small, polished wall, and Mrs. Lan asked about the tea house, about business, about the weather up on the hillside. She watched her mother's hands as they spoke, the way one thumb rubbed the same small spot on the porcelain again and again, slowly, without her seeming to notice. "And Yuri?" "Mrs. Lan asked at last, letting the name drop lightly, as if it cost her nothing. "He's well," Tu Tieu said. "He works hard. He takes good care of things." Tu Tieu set her cup down. She kept her voice calm and her hands still. "Mom," she said, "why haven't you come to the tea house?" She looked up briefly, then back down. "My health has been uneven, and the road is long. The neighbors have been in and out. It's been complicated." "I know the road is long," Tu Tieu said softly. "I drive it." A pause settled between them. Then, "Mrs. Lan said, Lin has been keeping me company. She's been very devoted lately. I don't like to leave her managing everything alone." Tu Tieu heard that sentence and let it land the way it was meant to. She had been hearing sentences like it for a long time. Her mother had a way of filling quiet moments with Lin's name, not always out of cruelty, but out of habit. A habit that had grown so deep it had become invisible to Mrs. Lan herself. Lin, who kept the household stable. Something passed through her eyes, recognition, or pain, or both together. But before she could form a reply, they both heard footsteps in the hallway. Lin appeared in the doorway the way she always did, smoothly, as if the room had simply been waiting for her to arrive. She was dressed neatly, her hair down, a warm smile already in place. It was the kind of smile that appeared before the rest of the face had fully decided how to feel. "Tu Tieu," she said, crossing the room with open arms. "What a lovely surprise. I had no idea you were coming today." Tu Tieu stood and accepted the brief embrace. Lin's perfume was faint and floral. Her hands were light and carefully placed. She settled beside Mrs. Lan on the sofa, not beside Tu Tieu, and reached over to pat the older woman's hand with easy affection. "I was just thinking this morning how much better Mother looks now that she's been resting properly." She smiled across the tray at Tu Tieu. "She always pushes herself too hard. You know how she is." Tu Tieu said yes. She knew. Lin adjusted a cushion and crossed her ankles with easy grace. "It's been such busy days lately," she said, almost to herself. "So much paperwork. The world never stops demanding signatures, does it?" She noticed that Lin had not once asked about her. Not about the tea house. Not about the long drive. Not about anything that did not somehow circle back to the household Lin was currently occupying. "Is Mother under a lot of stress?" Tu Tieu asked. She kept her voice perfectly mild. Something shifted in Lin's eyes. A subtle sharpening, like a lens pulling slowly into focus. She tilted her head just slightly. "Stress? Oh, not really. Just the ordinary business of keeping a home running well." She glanced at Mrs. Lan. "Isn't that right, Mother?" Mrs. Lan said yes, of course. Tu Tieu watched them both and said nothing more about it. A few minutes later, Mrs. Lan asked Tu Tieu to bring a blanket from the hallway cabinet. The days had been growing cooler, and there was an extra one folded somewhere near the bedroom end of the hall. The hallway was narrow and quiet, with a thin line of light coming in under the back door. She found the tall wooden cabinet and opened it. Blankets on the upper shelf, neatly stacked. She reached up, and that was when she noticed the side table. It sat at the base of the cabinet, dark wooded and plain, a small vase on top, a folded cloth. Nothing unusual until she looked at the drawer. There, where a drawer handle should simply be a handle, there was a lock, a small padlock, bronze-colored and clearly new. The wood around it bore faint scratch marks, not from age, but from use, from being opened and closed many times, in haste. And at the edge of the drawer's face, just above the lock, the wood held a faint, rectangular impression, the ghost of a label that had been peeled away recently, but one small corner had been missed in the peeling. In that corner, Tu Tieu could make out the partial curve of a stamp, 2 letters inside a circle, the kind of seal a company used on its official correspondence. Tu Tieu had seen that shape before. Yuri had shown her a photograph months ago now of envelopes that had been delivered to Mrs. Njia. Envelopes from the construction company, with that exact stamp, a construction company seal, inside a locked drawer. In her mother's home, she stood very still, the blanket pressed against her chest, and looked at the lock for a long moment. Then she heard footsteps coming from the living room, and she straightened up immediately. Mrs. Lan appeared at the far end of the hallway. Her eyes found Tu Tieu first, then dropped immediately to the side table. In that unguarded moment, her expression said everything that she would not say out loud. Then she crossed the hallway quickly and positioned herself between Tu Tieu and the drawer, as casually as she could manage, which was not very casually at all. She said, reaching out for the blanket. Her voice was a little too bright. "I'll take that, Mum." Tu Tieu kept her voice gentle. "Why is there a company seal on that drawer?" "Missus." Lan's eyes went very still. She held the blanket against her chest. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice had the particular flatness of someone who knows exactly what is meant and cannot afford to acknowledge it. Tu Tieu said quietly, "And there's a stamp impression in the wood at the edge. I recognized the shape." For one long moment, Mrs. Lan's face held still, and then something in it almost cracked. Her eyes brightened at the edges, the way they did when she was pressing down tears that were not permitted to fall. And what came out was quiet and firm. "Don't touch that drawer." She turned and walked back toward the living room without another word. Tu Tieu stood alone in the hallway, holding nothing now, looking at the lock. She stepped out through the back door onto the small porch. The air was cold and clean and smelled of pine and damp earth. She pressed her back against the outside wall and dialed. Yuri picked up on the second ring. "How is it going?" "There's a locked drawer," Tu Tieu said quietly. "In the hallway. New lock, and what's left of a company seal pressed into the wood. And when my mother saw me looking at it," she paused. She was frightened. A brief silence on the line. "Don't push on it today," he said. "Not with Lin in the house." "I wasn't going to. I know." His voice was calm and steady. "If your mother is afraid, we move gently, but we do not look away. Truth doesn't need a fight today. It just needs us to stay close to it." Tu Tieu exhaled. The cold air made a small cloud of her breath that drifted and disappeared. "There's something real in that drawer. Yuri, I can feel it." "Then it will still be there," he said, "when the time is right. Come home safely. Don't stay past the point where it stops feeling safe." She said she would. She said goodbye, and she stood for another moment in the cold quiet, watching a single bird move across the pale sky above the rooftop. Then she went back inside. Lin was in the kitchen, the sound of a glass being set down, a cupboard closing. Lan sat alone in the living room, the blanket draped across her lap now, her hands resting on top of it. Tu Tieu sat back down across from her. She didn't say anything right away. She picked up her cup, the tea was cold by now, and held it with both hands. After a moment, Mrs. Lan reached for the teapot, and poured. First for Tu Tieu, then for herself. Her movements were careful and slow, and her hands, Tu Tieu noticed, were trembling just slightly, as if they were carrying something heavier than a teapot. "Mom," Tu Tieu said softly, "are you being pressured?" Mrs. Lan did not answer right away. She kept both hands around the teapot, even though it was already back on the tray. She looked toward the hallway just for a second, checking, and then she looked back at Tu Tieu. She set the teapot down. She leaned forward, and in a voice so quiet that Tu Tieu had to hold completely still to catch every word, Mrs. Lan whispered, "Don't open it here." She picked up her cup. She turned to look out the window at the garden, at the pale afternoon light falling across the potted plants by the gate, and her face settled back into its usual composed expression, as if she had said nothing at all, as if nothing in this room had moved. But Tu Tieu's heart was beating very fast, because those 4 words could only mean one thing. The drawer was real. What was inside it was real. And somewhere in this house, perhaps very close, perhaps listening at this very moment, someone did not want it opened. Tu Tieu sat with her cold tea and her quiet fear, and looked at her mother, this woman she had spent a lifetime trying to reach, and thought, she knows. She has always known something, and she is frightened of what will happen when it comes to light. Outside, the mist had lifted from the mountaintops. But inside that small room, with its pressed cushions and its tidy tray and its carefully arranged surfaces, it had only just begun to settle in. Early one misty morning, Tu Tieu packs a small basket of tea, fruit, lands home. Everything looks perfectly arranged, but nothing feels warm. Lin is there too, polished and possessive, filling the room with soft smiles and careful words. During a simple errand in the hallway, Tu Tieu discovers something that stops her cold. A locked drawer bearing the faint impression of a construction company seal, the same company connected to Mrs. Ngia's collapse. When Mrs. Lan sees her daughter noticing it, fear flashes across her face. Later, alone with Tu Tieu for just a moment, she leans close and whispers 4 words.